Thank you.
Thank you, David. That's always, I think of Anna when I hear that song because that's her song in my mind. So thank you for reminding me of the song and of Anna. Thank you to everyone else who have joined us in Zoom land again today. And thank you to everyone who is joining us for the first time. These are amazing, interesting, odd, fascinating, and most peculiar times we find ourselves in. It's hard for me to remember what it was like a month ago when these talk titles and quotes and affirmations were gathered together. And yet, as usual, they're all exactly right on point. I saw a clever video yesterday on YouTube that someone had created. In it, a young woman from our present time shows up at the kitchen table of her younger self from about 4 months ago and tries to explain to her younger self what her life was going to be like in the future. It was a completely unfathomable idea to the younger self because there was nothing at all in the younger person's version of life that she could relate to. So imagine for a moment how the conversation would go for you between your present day you and a version of yourself who was living late last fall. How would you explain what life would be like in mid-April of 2020? Mostly homebound, with very few trips away from home, besides running out for essentials or walking in your neighborhood with or without your dogs. No actual physical socializing or going out to dinner or movies or any other entertainments. I think for me, the most amazing thing is libraries are closed. Libraries are never closed, but libraries are closed, gyms are closed. The creature comforts that we get used to are closed. Tumamock Hill is closed to hiking. And settling into this weird, odd thing that we do, doing everything by video over the internet or by phone, we're living this time, and sometimes it's still hard to comprehend. Still, there are some very bright spots. Some people who are willing to, are learning things so fast that it's almost incomprehensible and trying new things that mostly work. Sometimes they don't, but mostly they do. And one of the bright spots in my life, anyway, is the 12-week online meditation seminar that we started last Wednesday night. As far as I know, nobody has tried this before. And we had participants from Ontario, Canada, Oro Valley, Eloy, San Manuel, Saguaro West, and oh yeah, even somebody from Tucson. So with a little care and planning and forethought and planning and planning and planning, it mostly works. And if you want to join the class and get the full experience, show up at this Zoom room this Wednesday evening from 5 to 7 p.m. I've already arranged for 2 guest presenters for 2 of the evenings. One, the middle of May, a CSL minister from Las Vegas, who will lead the class in contemplative meditation following the teachings of Joel Goldsmith. And she's magnificent. And then another evening before then, we'll have a local author, a poet who's published, facilitate a practice of writing poetry as a meditative practice. So that's kind of exciting and different and cool, and who else would try stuff like this but us? And we are, and that's exciting. The only ones who don't benefit from having this space or this pause, as we started calling it in morning practice this week, are the ones who refuse to try new things or who are insistent that the world needs to operate exactly according to their preferences, desires, or demands. A couple of weeks ago, I was having a Zoom lunch with a group of CSL ministers in Phoenix, one of who was really struggling with how to connect with the older members of her congregation. She had convinced herself that they wouldn't learn things that were new. And one of the other ministers on the call said, well, everybody's got a phone. Even if they aren't computer savvy, they can still call in on the phone and participate in that way. So in the space of just a very few minutes, she moved from what couldn't possibly happen to what could be done. And that's what she has done since, for the most part. And all of us get to stare at that belief that we have about what's possible and what's not possible, and decide whether we want to be stuck there or whether we want to move into a new way of being. And it's human nature to resist change unless we're forced into it, I think. We just don't want to work that hard until, we have to. And actually, when I was working on this talk yesterday, it tickled me because I'm thinking about this idea of not wanting to work that hard. And Newton's first law of motion showed up in my head, and I thought, that is just too weird. So I went and looked it up, and it is an object that is rest will stay at rest unless a force, an equivalent force, acts upon it. So it's not just teenagers or people we consider lazy. It's natural. We are living in a time when a force, this novel coronavirus, and our desire not to create unnecessary illness or death in ourselves or others, creates opportunities for us to create new ways of being, living, communicating, and interacting if we're willing to engage in that new way of creating. So today's talk title, Persistent Arising. We have lots of reasons and lots of excuses not to arise. And you could say there's even a bias towards not arising. And yet, if we look deeply, there is something in us, when we listen for it and hear it, that gives us opportunities to move and arise into new ways of being. In the final volume of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy, there's a dialogue between Frodo the Hobbit and Gandalf the Wizard that the internet meme makers have had fun with lately. And Frodo says, or wrote, or whatever, I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened. And Gandalf, being the wise wizard that he was, so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. There are other forces in the world, Frodo, besides the will of evil. Bilbo was meant to find the ring, in which case you are also meant to have it. And that is an encouraging thought. So if we look at our position in this coronavirus thing, and if we look at it as we were meant to be here because we were meant to arise. We were meant to present ourselves and to learn and grow and expand because of that. Suddenly it turns from this terrible, horrible thing to something that at least has a silver lining, if nothing else. So I want to revisit today's spiritual thought and continue further down the page from A New Design for Living, page 118. We take a non-resistant attitude toward our conditions. The battle we need to wage is an inward one, with our own thinking. We need to destroy not the appearance or the condition, but the old, well-worn pathway of negative thinking, which was the causative factor. We need not fight those things in our experience which bring us insecurity. We need recognize that the only security we can ever experience must of necessity arise from the security we feel within ourselves. And that security rests entirely on our conviction and belief that there is a power greater than we are and that we can use it. We need a sound faith and conviction in the nature of life itself and its essential good and harmonious action. In the next paragraph, he continues, basically, all we have to do is learn to get rid of our fears and doubts, to remove all confusion and bewilderment, until at last we arrive, either through intuition or through the process of logical thinking, at the place where we can start out with the simple proposition that I am one with, in, or of God, the infinite creative intelligence, and I am no longer conditioned or controlled by any situation whatsoever. I mean, hey, all we have to do is get rid of our fears and doubts and not be confused or bewildered, right? Yeah, well, that's the spot that we're all aiming for. And remembering that we are one with the infinite creative intelligence and have the choice not to be conditioned or controlled by any external situation whatsoever is the space that we can stand, the space that we can act from, the space that we can choose to be in, no matter what new ways of being show up for us. Holmes finishes by saying, "This is where we start. This is the point of departure from being influenced by conditions to influencing them." I'll read that last sentence again. This is the point of departure from being influenced by conditions to influencing conditions. Instead of being the instead of being in the backseat of a runaway driverless car with endless hazards ahead, we now find ourselves in the driver's seat, calm, cool, and deliberate, with the knowledge of where we want to go and how we're going to get there. Then we proceed carefully to guide and direct our way along the highway of life. So how do we do that? What do we hitch our faith and belief onto with regard to the basic goodness of ourselves and our fellow humans? All of them, even the belligerent and difficult ones, and realize that all of life is for us, no matter what it looks like. That's the real question. We're not in the backseat of a runaway driverless car headed over a cliff unless we have been firmly and profoundly convinced that this is true and we believe it. And the bad news is, in that case, if we believe it, it's true for us. Master Teacher Jesus said, and Dr. Holmes regularly reiterated, it is our experience in our world that happens to us according to our belief. So if I am pessimistic about life, I am going to have a pessimist's life. And nothing can change that except my decision to see the world and to experience the world through different lenses, different viewpoints, and different eyes, making at least the possibility, a tiny sliver, available to have a different experience. Even just considering the possibility that all things work together for our good makes room for that possibility to exist. So this challenge of persistent arising comes from that perspective, leaving space or making room for good to come out of our present condition and staying engaged in the game of life for that to happen. I came across an article online this week on the Stockdale paradox. James Stockdale, you may remember him, was a prisoner of war for 8 years during the Vietnam War and spent much of his time in solitary confinement or being tortured. So fairly brutal conditions, not really much hope that anything would improve, not much hope that he would actually survive this thing. And yet his mental health and his resilience remained strong. The Stockdale paradox defines the optimism that is most important in becoming a resilient person. And that is when you're faced with a challenge or a trauma, you look at the challenge objectively. You might make the assessment, I'm really in big trouble. This is something that is somewhat unique to religious science. We don't deny that the problems exist. We do deny that they're in charge of us, though. So we may look at the world and say, well, masks and viruses and wash your hands and, people sneezing because they have allergies. We don't deny what we're experiencing. We do deny that it has power over us, and we don't have to react as though that's the end of the world. So the Stockton's paradox is seeing things in a positive light, that in the end I will prevail. I am tough. This is a tough spot. This is difficult. This is really hard. And I know in the end, I will be okay. And it's not necessarily creating that truth will happen, but in the interim, when you have limited things you can control, it's the only space that can give us any peace or tranquility or balance, really. So I want you to think about that, and how when the world is looking pretty bleak, it's like, okay, so what can I do with this? How can I make hay? How can I make sunshine in all this rain? There seem to be an awful lot of things, situations in our current circumstances that we have very little control over, and not a whole lot of actual, accurate data, knowledge, wisdom. And yet I do see each and all of us coming through this period of time stronger and more resourceful if we will just stay on course and do what's ours to do. I'm very fond of reading the writings of the Stoics and reading about Stoic philosophy. Stoicism actually suits my temperament. 5 or 6 years ago, I came across a book by William Irvine called A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy. In it, Irvine talks about the trichotomy of control, sorting our experiences into one of 3 categories: those over which we have complete control, those over which we have no control, and those over which we have some, but not complete control. He continues, the things in the second category, those over which we have no control, he suggests we set aside as not worrying about, because there's nothing we can do. He says he will spare himself a great deal of needless anxiety by not worrying about the things outside of his control. He will instead concern himself with things over which he has complete control, and things over which he has some but not complete control. And then, when he concerns himself with things in that last category, he is careful to set internal rather than external goals for himself, and thereby avoid a considerable amount of frustration and disappointment. So what are these things not in our control, not in your control, not in my control, that we spend time and energy frustrated about, or fretting or fussing? Whether other people wear masks or don't, whether they wash their hands frequently enough or properly or not, whether they practice social distancing properly or not, when the governor will reopen schools so we can get back to meeting in person or not, or when the hair salons get back in business so we can get our unruly hairs cut or colored, or when any government official is going to act the way we want them to. The list is endless and fruitless to even spend a nanosecond worrying about. Anything that is outside our control is outside our control, period. Wasting our precious life force demanding someone else meet our expectations and behave the way we want them to, I'm fairly convinced, is actually a distraction from things within our control, either full or partial, that we don't want to have to deal with or be responsible for. And so those things completely within our control are obvious. What we think, where we put our focus and intention, what we consume in any way, physically or mentally or emotionally, and what we do or don't do. What about those intermediate things? What about those things we have some control? I love what Irvine wrote about those. He will be careful to set internal rather than external goals for himself, and will thereby avoid a considerable amount of frustration and disappointment. Can I absolutely control how well I sleep at night? No, but I can control how late I stay up and how late in the day I have caffeine, if I know caffeine interrupts my sleep patterns. Same thing goes for watching disturbing or terrorizing videos, or late evening news, or chasing down the latest conspiracy theories and getting all riled up about them, or fill in what's true for you. We each have different triggers and different reactions. If we bother to pay attention, we have all the information we need to make helpful and healthful choices for ourselves. And by making those choices, we create a healthier baseline for anyone we happen to come across. So this middle path intrigues me because ultimately it's my decision about those things which concern me. And I either move that thing that concerns me into something within my control, what's mine to do here and now about this, or something outside my control. If I've actually done everything I can reasonably do, then what remains of this problematic thing is not mine to do. And then the next question, can I live with that? If the answer is no, what else can I do? If there's nothing, if there's absolutely nothing, then it actually moves to the category of something outside of mine to do, outside of my control, outside of my ability to affect it with anything other than prayer. So once we've answered that question a couple of times, and this will be uniquely true for each of us, and every situation will also need to be evaluated uniquely if we're interested in feeling at ease and tranquil, which is the goal of the Stoics. We have to be willing to let things go and let them be. There are things we can control, things we can impact, and things we just have to let be okay. So I want to close with a piece that I posted on our center's Facebook page a couple of weeks ago. It's a little diagram called "Who Do I Want to Be During COVID-19?" I didn't write it. I wish I did. It's masterful. Whoever wrote it is quite wise. The choices of responses were grouped into fearful things that I'm reacting to something I'm afraid of. And so then I'm hoarding toilet paper or whatever. Then ways I can act to become more conscious, more conscientious, and more caring about myself and others. And then the growth zone, truly ways we learn to manage our own thinking, our actions, and our reactions. Things that we can be in complete control of if we choose to be. May we decide to live, to choose to live on this green growing edge of our becoming, as Hildegard von Bingen once wrote, and it's one of my favorite quotes. If you've been around, you've heard me use it before. So remember to pay attention to your actions and reactions. And when you do that, you know automatically that you bless yourself. And by doing that, you bless everyone else as well. Thank you. So now I'd like to lead us in a moment of affirmative prayer. So if you join me in taking a breath, I know in this amazing space and time that we live in this opportunity to learn and grow and expand and be more, each one gets to see where their mind goes and what their decisions are, and gets to decide if that's where they choose to live. And if not, they get a chance to choose again. Because I know the divine is infinite, and I know possibilities is limitless, and I know each one at all times has a chance to choose again. One of the most joyful aspects of this teaching, of this philosophy, is that awareness of the perpetual do-over. I don't ever have to be down on myself for choosing badly. I just have to stand up and try again. And so I bless that awareness. I bless that remembrance. I bless that knowing that always, 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 the universe says, okay, good, now, next. So I bless this opportunity. I bless this space that I get to be in, that we all get to be in, of expansion and growth and more good. So relaxing into that like a comfortable hammock, I let it be, and so it is.